Okay, here's a rundown of my 4Runner. There's a lot of stuff I've done to it, and just a lot of things to know for future reference. So I guess start off with the engine. So this supercharger, this is a first gen supercharger, TRD supercharger. The second gens are black. These first gens were usually a light gray color, kind of an ugly gray color. My personal opinion about the first gen is that it's superior than the second gen supercharger. Reason being is that this supercharger has, you can take it apart a lot more, whereas the second gen supercharger is all one piece. So this one's a lot easier to rebuild and service, which is really a big plus. And it also was a lot easier for me to port and polish it. So yeah, so this thing, I took it all apart probably about 4 years ago. I've done some porting and polishing with cylinder heads before on some of my other one of my other vehicles, and I'd read up on porting and polishing a supercharger, so I went ahead and did that to this supercharger. So it's just kind of what just makes it a bit more efficient. The other thing I did was there's inside of here, there's silencer ports, and I plugged those. So the silencer ports basically have an effect so that it quiets down the whine of the supercharger. So by plugging those, it made the supercharger just like just a tad more efficient, not much. But you hear the whine of the supercharger a lot more. So that makes this a really unique piece, because I don't know of anyone else that's has a ported and polished TRD supercharger. And then having the silencer ports blocked off, it really screams like no other TRD supercharger out there, especially with the cold air intake. This is just a cold air intake from Amazon, nothing too fancy. It actually fits really nice. I had to trim this a little bit to make it fit the hood contour a little bit better, because it's actually for a Tacoma. But yeah, so the pulley on it, it's actually a stock pulley that I had machined down to 2.0 inches. So I think the stock pulley is 2.3. This is 2.0. So that's about as small as you want to go. I actually had one pulley on it that was a 1.8 that I had machined, but I had too much trouble with belt slippage just because there was so little for the belt to go on, and it kind of put the supercharger outside of its efficiency range, and I didn't see a whole lot of power increase. So for this style supercharger, it's about as small as a pulley you want to go. The thing is, with this small pulley running as much boost as it does, you really need to kind of keep an eye on the air-fuel ratio a little bit more, because it's kind of getting in a realm where you can do some damage if the engine gets too lean. So I do have an air-fuel ratio gauge in the vehicle. Let me show you that. So I kind of hit it down here. So yeah, that's the air fuel ratio gauge. So yeah, this just allows you to kind of keep an eye on the air fuel ratio. You don't want it to run too lean. So right now, the engine's on in open loop because nothing's warmed up. You just started it. So it's running off of the mass airflow sensor only right now. And then once the O2 sensor warms up, then it runs off of the mass airflow and the O2 sensor, and so then it goes into closed loop. So right now it's running at right around 12 to 1, so that's rich. 14.7 to 1 is considered perfect for a naturally aspirated engine or an engine that's not in boost. At idle, it really doesn't matter what the air-fuel ratio is. I mean, you know, it'll bounce between 14 and 19, somewhere in there. It's just at idle, it doesn't really hurt anything. When you're on decel, when you're like, kind of coasting down a hill or something, it's pretty often you'll see it go to 19 to 1. That's really lean, and that's just because the ECU is cutting fuel because it detects deceleration, and so it doesn't need any fuel in the engine. But when it has boost, you need to run richer with boost. So during boost, you want to see at bare minimum 14.7 to 1, which is but you really want to be even richer than that. You really ideally want to be around 12 to 1. If you're a little richer than that, as far as if you get an 11 or 10 to 1 air-fuel ratio, that's okay. But for maximum power, you want to be like 11.5 to 12 to 1 air-fuel ratio. You know, so it's kind of nice because it's just, you kind of keep an eye on it here and there and just make sure everything's running okay. And if you see under boost that it's really leaning out, then you either need to make some adjustments to the 7th injector, or there's something wrong. So, and actually the 7th injector on this, the electronic control module went bad, and I could tell because it was running lean. And so I got a new electronic control module from Underdog Racing Development. That's who makes the 7th injector kit. The company's called Underdog Racing. And yeah, so I got a new module. I haven't installed it because I wasn't sure if the 4Runner was going to sell with the supercharger or not. So it's like, well, why put the new module in if no one buys it with the supercharger? Which you did, so I'll go ahead and put the 7th injector module in and program it. And I'll also do a video of just kind of showing you a quick rundown how to modify the 7th injector program, and I'll send you the software. It's really pretty easy to mess with. So it's just kind of knowing some basics, and actually it's surprising a lot of people that do have the 7th injector really don't have a clue on how to program it. But there's some important things you just need to know when you're programming it to make it run well and get the most power out of it. Now if you go to a bigger pulley, like if you went to a stock pulley, like a 2.3, which there's a company called Pulley Boys. They sell different size pulleys for this. Underdog Racing as well sells different pulleys. But if you go with like a 2.3 pulley, which is a stock size, you can get away without the 7th injector. It just doesn't have near as much power with the 2.0. I've driven it a little bit without the 7th injector hooked up, but the way I'm compensating for without the 7th injector working is I'm using the water meth kit. So the water meth is it can serve a couple of purposes depending on what you want to do. It can act as a liquid intercooler. So since this supercharger doesn't have an intercooler, you can inject water meth into the airstream, and that'll kind of act as an intercooler, which will bump up power a little bit. But you don't have to use that. You can just use the 7th injector and run off of that. I'm trying to think before I move on to the water meth, what else I can tell you about just the supercharger itself. So if you ever need to rebuild it, that's the nice thing is to take the supercharger off, and then you can take these 4 bolts out, and then there's 4 nuts that on the back here, they're kind of hard to get to. You got to use a wrench, and you can take those nuts off, and this whole compressor unit right here, this and this, comes off. And so this compressor is a really common compressor, actually. It's called the M62 compressor. So GM used these compressors on some of their supercharged cars. So if you ever want to rebuild it, you just go on eBay, type in M62 supercharger rebuild kit, and they're like 170 bucks for the bearings and the seals and stuff. And if you look up on the forums, first gen gray TRD supercharger, you'll find threads on actually rebuilding these. It's not too bad, and it's good to kind of rebuild it more often than to let it go until problems come up, because if you keep on top of keeping it in good shape, the only thing that goes bad really is the bearings get a little worn, and you just replace the bearings, replace the seals, put fresh oil in it, good to go. If you let it go for a long time without a rebuild, the impellers can actually start to touch if the bearings get too bad, and then you can kind of do damage to the impellers, and then a rebuild goes up in price quite a bit. So yeah, so I got real high quality oil in this. I'm using this stuff. It's made by John Bond Performance. It's your high-end supercharger oil. So you know, I don't know how often you want to replace it. Probably with every timing belt change would probably be a good amount of, you know, interval to do it at bare minimum. You can do it more, you know, if you want. So let's see. Trying to think what else. So this pulley I had machined down from the stock pulley. The reason for that is just because the stock pulley, the way it's designed, it doesn't have any grip marks. Underdog Racing sells smaller pulleys as well, but they have grip grooves in the pulley, which helps the belt grip a little bit better, less slippage. However, that also wears the belt a lot faster. The belt won't last near as long. So, and I also had a little groove machine here, so that if you ever have to remove the pulley, you can grab it with a puller and yank it off. You never want to use a hammer or anything to pull this pulley off, because you do damage to the nose cone. So, yeah. So I think that's about it. The other thing to keep in mind is I did not install an aftermarket transmission cooler. A lot of people, what they do when they install a supercharger, it's a good idea to do, is to install a big transmission cooler in front of in the front here, down here. So the way I've gotten around that is the transmission does fine, except for when you're on a big hill, like on a mountain pass out here or something like that. So what I do is I just shut off overdrive, because overdrive, running this up a big hill in overdrive heats up. It you know, just puts a big load on the transmission, and it'll get hot, especially without a cooler. So I just take overdrive off, and I've actually monitored the transmission temperature with you know, that torque app, the Android torque app. You can monitor transmission temps with that, and the transmission stays fine as long as you have the overdrive off on a big hill. So just remember that. Or you can put in a tranny cooler up front. It's pretty easy to do. Lots of write-ups how to do that on the forums. It's not very expensive. It's really I don't know, I just never got around to it because I just knew to shut off overdrive. I kept that in mind. But you know, but if you get the transmission too hot, it'll kill it. So you don't want to let that happen. So battery's pretty new. Okay, so let's go to the water meth setup right now. So the pump is right down there. Let me get a flashlight.